Welcome to True Crime Trolls. Today, we're focusing on Japan, a country with its own share of dark and haunting tales. If you love true crime, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what stories you'd like to hear next. So with that said, get comfortable, settle in, and let's uncover the secrets together. In the early 1960s, Japan was a nation in transition, moving swiftly into modernity with newfound optimism. Yet beneath this facade of progress, a dark mystery began to unfold, one that would grip the nation with fear and confusion. The poisoned milk crisis, as it came to be known, started quietly, but soon spiraled into a terrifying enigma as children across the country fell ill from an unknown cause. It began in the small, serene city of Okayama on February 8th, 1960. The morning was as ordinary as any other until reports surfaced that several school children had suddenly become violently ill. These children, who had consumed their usual breakfast, were soon writhing in pain, clutching their stomachs as if an unseen force was tearing them apart from within. Parents watched in horror as their children vomited uncontrollably, their faces pale and twisted with agony. Doctors at the local hospital were baffled. They ran every test imaginable on the milk that the children had consumed, but nothing was out of the ordinary. The milk was pasteurized, handled according to strict safety standards, and showed no traces of harmful bacteria or toxins. The authorities, equally puzzled, assured the public that the milk was safe. But the cases continued to rise. As the days turned into weeks, more children fell ill across the region. By May 1962, the situation had escalated to a full-blown crisis. In the bustling city of Fukuoka, parents were gripped with fear as dozens of children exhibited the same terrifying symptoms: high fevers, severe stomach cramps, and debilitating nausea swept through the schools, leaving classrooms half empty and hospital wards overflowing. The affected children all had one thing in common: they had consumed milk from local dairies. But why were only some children affected, while others, who drank the same milk, remained perfectly healthy? This question plagued the minds of parents, doctors, and authorities alike. As panic spread, so did the rumors. Some whispered that the milk might have been cursed, or that an ancient spirit had been angered. Others speculated that the water used to clean the milk bottles was contaminated with some unknown toxin. Fear of the unknown gripped the nation, and trust in the once reliable dairy industry crumbled. With no clear answers in sight, the public began to suspect everything around them. The water supply, once considered pure and life-giving, became a source of dread. In some neighborhoods, families refused to drink tap water, convinced that it was the cause of their children's suffering. Rumors spread that the government was hiding the truth, that the contamination was more widespread than they admitted. Restaurants and cafes saw a sharp decline in customers. Milk, once a staple in every household, was now seen as a potential poison. Parents refused to let their children drink it, opting instead for alternatives that they hoped would be safer. Even schools began to ban milk from their lunch programs, fearing that they might be next in the line of tragedies. Authorities were under immense pressure to find the cause of the illness. They investigated every possible lead, from the dairies to the water treatment plants, but every test came back negative. The milk was clean, the water was pure, yet the children kept getting sick. The fear and uncertainty began to take a psychological toll on the population. people started to imagine dangers in every corner of their lives. Supermarkets began to see shelves of dairy products go untouched as milk, yogurt, and cheese were left to expire. Grocery stores posted signs reassuring customers that their products were safe, but the assurances fell on deaf ears. Communities that once thrived on social gatherings now became isolated as neighbors withdrew into their homes, too afraid to trust the food or water offered by others. Schools became battlegrounds of fear, with parents demanding answers and pulling their children out of classes in protest. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. Conversations were dominated by the latest cases, each story more horrifying than the last. Some began to speculate that this was an act of bioterrorism, a deliberate attempt to destabilize the nation. Others believed it was a government experiment gone wrong, or worse, a cover-up for something far more sinister. In October 1963, after nearly 3 years of relentless fear and investigation, the case took an unexpected turn. Masaru Kuroda, a former dairy worker with a history of mental instability, was arrested. Under intense questioning, Kuroda confessed to a horrifying scheme. He had been slipping strychnine, a deadly poison, into the milk supply at various distribution points. His motive? A twisted desire to cause chaos and suffering, driven by deep-seated personal grudges against society. Kuroda's confession shocked the nation. The poison had been undetectable by the standard tests of the time, explaining why the authorities had been unable to trace the cause. His meticulous planning and execution had allowed him to avoid detection for so long, creating an atmosphere of fear that paralyzed the country. Kuroda's arrest brought an end to the immediate crisis, but the damage had been done. The psychological scars left by the poisoned milk crisis would take years to heal. Trust in the dairy industry was shattered, and new regulations were swiftly implemented to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. But the fear lingered. Even after Kuroda's confession, many found it hard to believe that a single man could have caused so much pain and suffering. The question remained in the minds of many: could there be others like him, waiting to strike again? On February 9th, 1982, Japan Airlines Flight 350, a routine domestic flight, was en route from Fukuoka to Tokyo's Haneda Airport. What began as an ordinary journey for the 166 passengers and 8 crew members on board would soon turn into a nightmare. The events that unfolded that day were not caused by mechanical failure or adverse weather conditions, but by something far more terrifying: a human descent into madness. Japan Airlines Flight 350 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-861 aircraft, one of the many reliable planes in the airline's fleet. The day was clear, with perfect flying conditions. The flight had taken off from Fukuoka Airport at 7:34 a.m. and was expected to land at Haneda just a little over an hour later. The passengers, a mix of businessmen, families, and travelers, were settling into their routines, some napping, others reading, while the cabin crew went about their duties with the practiced efficiency typical of Japan Airlines. In the cockpit, Captain Seiji Katagiri was in command. He was an experienced pilot with more than 12,000 flight hours under his belt. Assisting him were First Officer Yoshifumi Sasaki and Flight Engineer Yoshimi Ozaki. The takeoff and climb to cruising altitude were uneventful, with the aircraft performing exactly as expected. But as the flight approached Tokyo, the calm atmosphere in the cockpit began to unravel. Unknown to the crew and passengers, Captain Katagiri had been battling severe mental health issues for some time. In the weeks leading up to the flight, he had exhibited signs of stress and paranoia, yet had not sought help or disclosed his condition to his superiors. Katagiri's deteriorating mental state would soon manifest in a catastrophic way. As Flight 350 neared Tokyo, the aircraft began its descent toward Haneda Airport. It was a routine procedure that Katagiri had performed countless times before. However, at approximately 8:35 a.m., just as the plane was on final approach, Katagiri abruptly disengaged the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft. Without warning, he pushed the throttle levers to idle, causing the engines to reduce power dramatically. The aircraft, which had been descending at a controlled rate, began to lose altitude rapidly. The sudden change in speed and altitude jolted the other crew members to attention. First Officer Sasaki, alarmed by the captain's actions, quickly questioned Katagiri, asking what was wrong. But Katagiri did not respond coherently. His eyes were wide, with a mix of fear and determination, and he began mumbling to himself, as if in a trance. The flight engineer, realizing the danger, attempted to intervene. He reached for the throttle controls, but Katagiri, now fully gripped by his delusions, violently swatted his hand away. He shouted incoherently, making it clear that he was no longer in control of his faculties. With the aircraft in a steep descent, First Officer Sasaki knew that they had only seconds to act. He tried to wrest control of the plane from Katagiri, but the captain, in his delusional state, fought back with surprising strength. The cockpit became a scene of chaos as the two men struggled for control of the aircraft. Sasaki and the flight engineer attempted to pull the plane out of its dive, but Katagiri's erratic behavior made it nearly impossible. As the ground rapidly approached, the passengers were unaware of the full extent of the danger, though many began to sense that something was wrong. The plane was descending too quickly, and some passengers instinctively braced themselves for impact. The cabin crew, too, were puzzled and alarmed by the sudden change in the flight's trajectory, but they had little time to react. In the cockpit, the struggle reached a fever pitch. The first officer managed to overpower Katagiri just enough to pull back on the control column, trying desperately to level the aircraft, but it was too late. At 8:43 a.m., the DC-8 hit the surface of Tokyo Bay, just short of the runway. The impact was devastating. The plane broke apart as it struck the water, its fuselage shattering upon impact. The force of the crash caused the cockpit to disintegrate, while the passenger cabin, now partially submerged, began to fill with freezing water. The scene inside the cabin was one of horror and chaos as passengers struggled to free themselves from the wreckage. Despite the severity of the crash, 149 passengers and crew members miraculously survived. Many of them escaped from the sinking aircraft through emergency exits, swimming to safety, or being rescued by nearby boats. However, 24 passengers and 4 crew members, including the flight engineer, lost their lives in the crash. The survivors were in shock, unable to comprehend how a routine flight had turned into a deadly disaster. As rescue operations continued, questions began to arise about what had caused the crash. The wreckage was quickly recovered, and investigators began the painstaking process of piecing together the final moments of Flight 350. The investigation revealed the shocking truth. The crash had been caused by deliberate actions taken by Captain Katagiri. The cockpit voice recorder captured the chaotic struggle between Katagiri and his crew, providing chilling evidence of the captain's mental breakdown and the first officer's desperate attempts to save the aircraft. Further investigation into Katagiri's background uncovered that he had been suffering from severe mental health issues, including depression and paranoid delusions. However, these issues had not been reported to Japan Airlines or the aviation authorities, raising serious questions about the airline's mental health screening and support systems for pilots. The revelation that the crash was a result of a pilot's actions sent shockwaves through the aviation community and the public. It was a stark reminder of the critical importance of mental health in the high-stakes world of aviation. The incident led to significant changes in how airlines around the world monitor and support the mental well-being of their pilots. The tragedy of Japan Airlines. Flight 350 left an indelible mark on those who survived and the families of those who perished. The survivors struggled with the trauma of the crash and the knowledge that it could have been prevented. Many of them spoke out about their experiences, calling for better mental health support for pilots and stricter regulations to prevent such tragedies in the future. In the years following the crash, Japan Airlines implemented new policies aimed at better identifying and supporting pilots with mental health issues. These changes were part of a broader global shift in the aviation industry toward prioritizing the psychological well-being of flight crews, recognizing that the mental state of those in the cockpit is as critical as their technical skills. Japan is no stranger to crime stories that shake the nation to its core, but few have instilled as much fear and horror as the case of Kiyotaka Katsuta. Known as the Hammer Killer, Katsuta was responsible for a string of brutal murders during the late 1970s and early 1980s. His crimes were marked by their sheer brutality and randomness, as he targeted innocent victims with a weapon as mundane as a hammer. Katsuta's killing spree left a trail of devastation and fear in its wake, forever etching his name into the dark annals of Japan's criminal history. Kiyotaka Katsuta was born on March 28, 1948, in a small town in Gifu Prefecture, Japan. His early life was unremarkable, marked by a quiet and introverted demeanor. However, behind his seemingly calm exterior, Katsuta harbored deep-seated anger and frustration, stemming from a troubled childhood. His father was abusive, and his mother was often distant, leaving Katsuta to fend for himself emotionally. As a result, he grew up feeling isolated and resentful, with a growing hatred for society. Katsuta's early adulthood was similarly uneventful. He worked a series of menial jobs and struggled to form lasting relationships. His sense of alienation only deepened, and by his late 20s, Katsuta had developed a morbid fascination with death and violence. This dark interest eventually manifested in the form of violent fantasies, which he began to plan out in chilling detail. Katsuta's first known murder took place on February 16, 1972. He was 24 years old. His victim was a young woman in her early 20s whom he encountered while she was walking home from work late at night. Katsuta had been prowling the streets, looking for a target. When he spotted the woman, he followed her until she reached a secluded area. There, he attacked her from behind with a hammer, bludgeoning her to death in a frenzied assault. Afterward, he fled the scene, leaving his victim's body in a pool of blood. The randomness and savagery of the attack shocked the local community, but without any witnesses or clear motive, the police had little to go on. Katsuta's first murder was classified as a robbery gone wrong, but in reality, it was the beginning of a killing spree that would span nearly a decade. After his first murder, Katsuta's appetite for violence only grew. Over the next several years, he embarked on a series of brutal killings, targeting the women and elderly individuals who were alone and vulnerable. His weapon of choice remained the hammer, which he used to inflict maximum damage with minimal effort. The sheer brutality of his attacks earned him the moniker the Hammer Killer. Katsuta's victims were often ambushed while they were walking alone at night or in the early morning hours. He would strike them multiple times with the hammer, ensuring their deaths were both swift and violent. In some cases, he also robbed his victims of their belongings, though the primary motivation behind the murders appeared to be a desire for power and control. Katsuta was meticulous in his approach, choosing victims at random and varying his methods to avoid detection. He would often scout out his victims beforehand, studying their routines and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His ability to blend into the background and avoid suspicion allowed him to continue his killing spree undetected for years. One of Katsuta's most notorious crimes occurred in 1974 when he targeted an entire family in their home. On the night of December 17th, Katsuta broke into the house of a middle-aged couple and their two children, ages 10 and 7. Armed with his hammer, he brutally bludgeoned all four members of the family to death as they slept. The crime shocked the nation, not only because of its brutality, but also because of the apparent lack of motive. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing of value had been stolen from the home. The only clues left behind were the bloodied footprints of the killer, which led investigators to believe that the murderer had acted alone. Despite an extensive investigation, the police were unable to identify the perpetrator, and the case went cold. Katsuta was not driven by impulse alone. He was a calculated and methodical killer who planned his crimes with precision. He often changed his appearance, growing or shaving his beard, changing his hairstyle, and altering his clothing to avoid detection. He also moved frequently, traveling across different prefectures in Japan to commit his murders. This constant movement made it difficult for law enforcement to connect the crimes, as they were often spread out over large geographic areas. In some cases, Katsuta would wait months or even years before striking again, leading police to believe that the murders were unrelated. This pattern of random and seemingly unconnected killings frustrated investigators and heightened public fear, as no one knew when or where the Hammer Killer would strike next. Katsuta's killing spree came to an abrupt end on January 9th, 1982, nearly a decade after his first murder. On that day, He attempted to rob a taxi driver in Tokyo, using his hammer as a weapon. However, the driver fought back, and in the struggle, Katsuda was overpowered and detained by passersby until the police arrived. During his interrogation, Katsuda confessed to the attempted robbery, but as the investigation continued, police began to suspect that he might be involved in other crimes. When they searched his home, they discovered a collection of hammers and other items that had been reported missing by his victims over the years. The evidence was overwhelming, and Katsuda soon confessed to the murders, providing details that only the killer would know. Kiyotaka Katsuda's trial was one of the most sensational in Japanese history. The public was horrified by the sheer number and brutality of his crimes, and the media dubbed him Japan's Hannibal Lecter. Katsuda showed little remorse for his actions, claiming that he had felt a sense of power and control when committing the murders. In 1983, Katsuda was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. He spent the next several years on death row, during which time he refused to apologize to the families of his victims or acknowledge the pain he had caused. On November 30th, 2000, Katsuda was executed by hanging at the Tokyo detention house. His death marked the end of one of Japan's most notorious criminal cases, but the memory of his crimes continues to haunt the nation. Kiyotaka Katsuda's killing spree remains one of the darkest chapters in Japan's criminal history. His cold-blooded and random attacks terrorized communities across the country, and his ability to evade capture for nearly a decade highlighted the challenges faced by law enforcement in dealing with such a cunning and ruthless killer. The case of the Hammer Killer serves as a chilling reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist in even the most unassuming individuals, and the lasting impact that such crimes can have on society. In the tumultuous years following World War II, Japan was a nation in transition, struggling to rebuild its economy and society. Amid the devastation and scarcity of the post-war period, a sense of unease pervaded the population. It was during this fragile time that a horrific incident would unfold, one that would leave an indelible mark on the nation's history. The Kotobuki-san-in incident, a mass poisoning that claimed the lives of 12 people and left many more in shock and fear. The 1950s were a time of rapid change in Japan. The nation was still reeling from the devastation of World War II, and the process of reconstruction was underway. With food and resources in short supply, many people struggled to make ends meet. The government was working tirelessly to stabilize the economy, but it was a slow and challenging process. The black market thrived, and a general atmosphere of mistrust and desperation hung over the country. In this environment of uncertainty, any disruption to daily life could cause widespread panic. Food safety, in particular, was a major concern, as people depended on whatever rations and provisions they could acquire. The notion that something as essential as food could become a vehicle for mass murder was unthinkable until it happened. Located in the bustling district of Nihonbashi in Tokyo, the Kotobuki-sanin restaurant was a popular eatery known for its affordable and hearty meals. It was the kind of place where salarymen would gather after work, where families could enjoy a meal together, and where the community could find a moment of respite from the hardships of post-war life. On a typical evening, the restaurant would be filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the clinking of dishes. But on January 26, 1953, the atmosphere at Kotobuki-san-in was anything but typical. That night, the restaurant was crowded with patrons enjoying their dinner. They had no reason to suspect that anything was amiss as they sat down to eat. However, as the evening progressed, something terrible began to unfold. As the patrons of Kotobuki-san-in enjoyed their meals, an insidious danger lurked in their midst. Unbeknownst to them, the food they were consuming had been laced with a deadly poison, sodium arsenite, a highly toxic compound. The poison had been introduced into the food at some point before it was served, but how and by whom remained a mystery. Shortly after finishing their meals, several customers began to feel unwell. At first, the symptoms were mild: nausea, dizziness, and stomach cramps. Some patrons assumed it was simply a case of food poisoning, a common enough occurrence in those days. But as time went on, the symptoms rapidly worsened. People started collapsing in their seats, writhing in agony as the poison wreaked havoc on their bodies. Panic quickly spread through the restaurant as more and more people fell ill. Those who could still move rushed to the doors, desperate to escape the source of their torment, while others lay on the floor, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. The scene was one of utter chaos. The restaurant staff, themselves in a state of shock and confusion, tried to help the victims, but it was clear that something far more sinister than mere food poisoning was at play. Emergency services were quickly called to the scene, but by the time they arrived, the situation had already spiraled out of control. Dozens of people were in critical condition, and despite the best efforts of paramedics and doctors, 12 people died that night. The survivors were rushed to nearby hospitals, where they were treated for severe poisoning. Many of them would suffer from lasting health effects, including organ damage and neurological problems. The authorities immediately launched an investigation into the incident. The deaths and widespread illness at Kotobuki-sanin sent shockwaves through the community and the nation as a whole. The idea that someone could have deliberately poisoned the food at a popular restaurant was almost too horrifying to comprehend. Who could have committed such a heinous act, and why? The police investigation into the Kotobuki-sanin incident was one of the most intense and far-reaching in post-war Japan. Detectives scoured the restaurant for clues, interviewing staff and patrons, and examining every aspect of the food preparation process. They quickly determined that the poisoning was no accident. The sodium arsenite had been deliberately introduced into the food. But who was responsible? The restaurant's staff were thoroughly interrogated, but no clear suspects emerged. None of the employees had any known criminal background, and there was no evidence to suggest that they had any motive to commit such a crime. The investigators expanded their search to include suppliers, delivery workers, and even former employees, but the results were the same: no viable suspects. As the days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. The public was gripped by fear, with many people too frightened to eat out at restaurants. Rumors and speculation ran rampant, with some suggesting that the poisoning was the work of a disgruntled customer, while others believed it was an act of terrorism or even a black market deal gone wrong. But despite these theories, no concrete evidence could be found to support them. With the investigation stalled, various theories emerged to explain the motive behind the mass poisoning. One theory suggested that the poisoner had a personal vendetta against the restaurant or its owners. Perhaps a former employee or a dissatisfied customer had decided to take revenge in the most brutal way possible. Another theory posited that the poisoning was an attempt to sabotage the business, possibly by a rival restaurant or a criminal gang involved in the black market. Some even speculated that the incident was an act of political terrorism designed to sow fear and chaos in a nation already struggling to rebuild. Japan in the 1950s was a country in transition, with various political and social tensions simmering beneath the surface. The idea that someone might have used poison as a weapon to destabilize society was not entirely far-fetched. However, without any concrete evidence, these theories remained just that, speculation. The true motive behind the kotobuki sanin poisoning remained a mystery. The impact of the kotobuki sanin incident on Japanese society was profound. The randomness and brutality of the crime shattered the public's sense of security. If such an attack could happen in a busy, well-respected restaurant, it could happen anywhere. People became wary of eating out, and the food industry faced increased scrutiny as authorities and consumers alike demanded better safety standards. The incident also had a lasting effect on law enforcement and food safety regulations in Japan. The case highlighted the need for more stringent controls over the food supply chain and better oversight of public health. While the specific measures taken in response to the incident were not immediate, it set the stage for future reforms aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Despite the best efforts of the police, the Kotobuki San-in case eventually went cold. No suspects were ever identified, and the motive behind the poisoning remained elusive. The case was officially closed without resolution, leaving the families of the victims and the survivors with more questions than answers. For many, the Kotobuki San-in incident became a haunting reminder of the fragility of life in post-war Japan. It was a crime that defied easy explanation, a random act of violence that seemed to embody the uncertainty and fear of the times.